Next up, I wanted to go through camera settings, camera setup, and how I set up my camera to get the look that you guys see for all of my videos. So I usually recommend starting with an iPhone if you already have an iPhone, especially if you're really starting out on making video content, because it's a camera that you already have in your pocket. It's just easy to get going. And the iPhone camera really is good. The only reason I use sort of mirrorless cameras like this, higher end cameras, pro cameras, is because that's the only way you're going to get the nice shallow depth of field. So as you can see, I'm nice and focused in frame, but then everything else behind me is nice and blurry. That's the only way you're really going to get that look if you use sort of a professional camera. You're not unfortunately going to get that with an iPhone. So you have to get a balance of the two. I still think it's okay to start with an iPhone. There are lots of YouTube channels out there where all they use is iPhones. But if you're looking for that specific look that I have, then you're going to need a professional camera like this one. The one I'm using here is the Sony a7 IV. I have it set up like this so that you can see the settings. If you have the budget, this is definitely one of the best cameras to get right now, especially if you want to make high quality video content. So I wanted to run through the settings on the camera to show you the shot that I get, this shot right here, and the shots that I get in my other videos as well. So the first thing we need to do is go into the menu and make sure that we're shooting in 4K, of course. I'm shooting in XAVC S4K. Now these settings obviously aren't going to be the same on every single camera, but as long as you're shooting in 4K, that's the main thing. We also want to make sure the camera is in manual, so I have everything set to manual, and then the frame rate is set at 24 frames per second, so you can see I have 24p. Some people prefer 30 frames per second, which is fine. I just prefer 24 frames per second because I personally think it looks more cinematic and it's what I've been shooting in. When it comes to the recording setting itself, I'm choosing the highest option on the Sony a7 IV, 100 megabits per second, 422 10-bit. Now I don't want to get into the technical details of what 422 is or what 10-bit is, but just try and choose the highest option, because the more data you have to play with, the more leeway you will have when it comes to changing the color, changing the brightness, and just the overall quality of the image. Then we want to choose the appropriate picture profile for our camera. So most modern cameras, Sony, Panasonic, and others do offer log sort of profiles, log formats when it comes to shooting. And what a log profile is basically, it's a flat sort of picture of your video recording so that it makes it easier to edit when it comes to editing, when it comes to color grading and stuff like that. So there are a bunch on the Sony a7 IV, but on the Sony a7 IV, we're going to be going to picture profile 8 and then choosing S-Log3. S-Log3 on these cameras is absolutely fantastic. It gives you the best image quality for sure. Like I said, I'm always shooting in manual just so that I can control the settings, just so that nothing automatically adjusts on the camera. And because we're shooting 24 frames per second, we want to make sure our shutter speed is around double what the frames per second is. That's just a general rule. You can adjust it if you like, but I usually keep the shutter speed at double the frame rate. So we can see it's at 50, but I can adjust it if I need to. I'm going to keep it at 50 because that is nearly double, or just over double of 24 frames per second. Then when it comes to the aperture, I try and keep it as low as I can. So with a lens like this, I can get it down to 2.8. When it comes to the ISO, I try and keep the ISO at the base ISO. So you know what the base ISO on your camera is when you don't have the lines underneath the ISO lettering and the number lettering. So we can see on this camera, the base ISO is 800. Then we want to choose the white balance of our camera. So the white balance should match the lighting. Usually I shoot at 5600 Kelvin. That's what all of my lights are, apart from these two lights here. The main key light should be 5600 Kelvin. So we can go into the camera here and we can choose a custom white balance and choose 5600 Kelvin. Another thing I wanted to quickly mention, and is why I recommend the Sony a7 IV, is because it shoots at 60 frames per second. A lot of modern cameras do shoot at 60 frames per second as well, but a lot of my B-roll, which we'll be going into later on in the course, is shot at 60 frames per second. So that's something to keep in mind. When it comes to lens choice for the camera, I would recommend starting off with one lens like this one, the 28-75, or you can get a 28-70, sort of all-round zoom lens, because that will do 90% of the things that you need it to do. The other thing is the aperture. The aperture on this lens is 2.8, and I like to go for lenses that are 2.8 or lower. The lower the aperture, the more depth of field that you get. So the lens that I'm using right now to record the A-roll, to record this shot right now, is a 24mm 1.4 aperture. With that 1.4 aperture, I can get super nice separation of me in focus, but the background is super nice and blurry. That's what I want. I want that nice blurry background. And the only way to get that is with low aperture lenses. Something like this, I would recommend getting later on. I think a lens like this one, where you just have one lens that does it all, is a much better way to start. Once you get used to using cameras, once you understand lenses a bit more, once you understand cameras a bit more, then I'd recommend going on to more expensive lenses like the one I'm using for this setup.